The Galactic Concord had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. 17 different species sat on its great council. They had built empires across 1,000 worlds. They had created peace where there was once war. They believed they knew everything about the universe and the creatures that lived in it. They were wrong about many things, but they were most wrong about a small blue planet orbiting an ordinary yellow star in the outer spiral arm of the galaxy. When the human ship appeared near the Yuletary Trade Station in the year 2147, it sent waves of panic through the entire council. The vessel was small and crude by galactic standards. Its hull was made of simple metals. Its engines burned chemical fuel mixed with early fusion technology. But it had done something that should have been impossible for such a young species. It had crossed the void between stars. Captain Daniel Harris stood on the bridge of his ship and stared at the massive station floating before him. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and calm eyes that had seen too many hard days back on Earth. Beside him stood his first officer, Lieutenant Commander Katie Morrison. She was younger than him by 20 years, with sharp features and a mind that worked faster than most computers. Behind them, the 40 other crew members watched their instruments with a mixture of wonder and growing fear. "Sir," Katie said quietly, "I am counting over 200 vessels around that station. None of them look human. None of them look friendly." Daniel nodded slowly. He had trained his whole life for this moment. He had dreamed of first contact since he was a boy reading old science fiction novels in his father's library back in Ohio, but the reality was nothing like the dreams. The alien ships were beautiful and terrible. They moved with a grace that made his own vessel look like a child's toy made of tin and wire. "Open a channel," he said. "All frequencies. Let them know we come in peace." The message went out into the void. For 17 long minutes there was only silence. The crew barely breathed. Then the reply came. It was not a greeting. It was not a welcome. It was a summons to appear before the highest authority in known space. The council chamber was larger than any building Daniel had ever seen on Earth. The ceiling stretched so high that clouds formed near the top. Real clouds made of water vapor that drifted slowly in the artificial atmosphere. 17 platforms floated in a great circle, each one holding the representatives of a different species. Daniel and Katie stood on a small platform in the center, surrounded by beings that defied human imagination. The Zalori were tall and thin, skin like polished silver, and eyes that held no warmth or mercy. The Varaxi were insectoid creatures with clicking mandibles and 6 arms that never stopped moving in complex patterns. The Moravathi were made of living crystal, their bodies catching the light and throwing rainbows across the chamber walls. There were others too, creatures of gas and creatures of stone, beings that floated without wings, and beings that crawled on dozens of legs. All of them looked down at the 2 humans with expressions that ranged from mild curiosity to open disgust. Ambassador Githron of the Zelari Dominion spoke first. His voice was cold and precise, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. "You are the species known as human. You come from the 3rd planet of an unremarkable star in the outer spiral arm. Your civilization is young, barely 10,000 years old. Your technology is primitive by our standards. And yet you have somehow found your way to our space. This is concerning." Daniel straightened his shoulders and tried to look confident. "We come seeking friendship and trade. We wish to learn from you and share what we know. We believe that together, our species can accomplish great things." A sound rippled through the chamber. It took Daniel a moment to realize it was laughter. Cold, mocking laughter from beings who saw humanity as nothing more than clever animals who had learned a few tricks. "Share what you know," Kithrin repeated slowly. "And what could you possibly teach us? We have watched your world for many of your centuries. We have seen your wars and your endless cruelty to each other. We have seen you poison your own air and water for profit. We have seen you build weapons capable of destroying your entire species many times over. You are not a species that builds. You are a species that destroys." Katie stepped forward, her jaw tight with anger she was struggling to control. "With respect, Ambassador, we have also built schools and hospitals. We have created art and music that moves the soul. We have reached beyond our world to explore the unknown. We have made terrible mistakes, yes, but we have also shown the capacity to learn from them. Surely that counts for something? The Viraxi representative made a harsh clicking sound that the translator rendered as contempt. It counts for nothing. Your species is aggressive and unpredictable. Your population grows without any control or planning. Our calculations show that within 200 years, you would spread across 3 sectors and destabilize the entire region. You breed like insects and fight like predators. This combination is unacceptable. Daniel felt his heart grow cold in his chest. This was not a welcome. This was not first contact as he had imagined it. This was a trial. The verdict had already been decided before they even arrived. The ancient Sithrani sat on the highest platform of all. They were the oldest species in the council, beings of pure energy contained in delicate shells of woven light. They had existed before most stars in the galaxy were born. They had not spoken a single word since the humans arrived. They simply watched with eyes that held the weight of countless ages. Ambassador Kithrin raised one silver hand to call for order. We will now vote on the matter of Earth. The question before us is simple. Should these humans be granted provisional membership in the Galactic Concord? Or should they be classified as a quarantine species, confined to their own solar system forever, their expansion halted before it can begin? One by one, the votes were cast. The Zelleri voted against humanity. The Viraxi voted against. The Morvathi calculated the odds of human expansion causing problems and voted against. Species after species made their choice. And each choice was exactly the same. Katie kept count in her head, hoping against hope that someone would see value in humanity. 15 votes against, 1 abstention from the silent Sithrani, 0 votes in favor of giving Earth a chance. Kithrin's voice echoed through the great chamber with finality. The decision is made, and it is final. Earth will be quarantined. A suppression fleet will be sent to disable all human vessels beyond the orbit of Mars. A permanent blockade will be established around your solar system. Your species will remain confined until such time as you prove yourselves worthy of freedom, which our projections suggest will be never. Daniel felt something shift deep inside his chest. The hope he had carried across the stars turned to cold ash. But beneath that ash, something else began to burn. Something older and harder than hope. Something that had kept humanity alive through ice ages and plagues and wars that should have ended them. May I speak one final time? He asked. Kithrin made a dismissive gesture with his silver hand. You may speak if you wish. Though your words will change nothing that has been decided here today. Daniel looked around the chamber at the beings who had just sentenced his entire species to eternal imprisonment. He looked at their ancient ships and their advanced technology and their absolute certainty that they knew what was best for every species in the galaxy. You have made your choice based on our past, he said. His voice was calm and steady despite the fire building inside him. You have seen our wars and our mistakes and our capacity for destruction, but you have not seen what we become when we are given no other choice. You have not seen what humans can do when we are backed into a corner with nothing left to lose. The council members shifted on their platforms. Some looked amused by his words. Some looked bored and ready to move on to other business. None of them looked even slightly worried. I hope for your sake, Daniel continued, that you never have to learn what we are truly capable of. He turned and walked back to the transport that would take him to his ship. Katie followed close behind with her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Neither of them looked back at the council that had just condemned their world. The council dismissed his words as the desperate bravado of a primitive mind facing a reality it could not accept. They congratulated themselves on handling the matter so efficiently. They returned to their comfortable lives and their ancient routines. Certain that they had solved the human problem before it could truly begin, they did not know that they had just made the worst mistake in the entire history of the galaxy. They did not know that the small vessel leaving their station carried a message that would unite an entire world in common purpose. They did not know that the species they had just condemned would spend every single waking moment preparing for a war unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The humans went home to their small blue planet, and they began to build. The news reached Earth 3 days after Captain Daniel Harris returned from the Galactic Concorde. Every television screen and computer and phone on the planet showed the same footage. Alien beings in a chamber larger than cities had voted to imprison humanity forever. The species that had dreamed of stars since they first looked up at the night sky had been told they would never be allowed to reach them. For one day, the world was silent with shock. For another day, people argued about what it meant and who was to blame and whether the aliens were right about humanity. But on the third day, something changed. Something deep and old woke up in the human spirit. It was the same thing that had driven their ancestors to cross frozen continents and build boats to sail unknown seas. It was the refusal to accept defeat. Admiral Gregory Palmer was 62 years old when the emergency call came. He had served in 3 wars and had hoped never to see another conflict in his lifetime. He had been planning to retire to a small house by a lake and spend his remaining years fishing and reading books about ancient history. Instead, he found himself standing before the newly formed United Nations Emergency Assembly, looking at faces from every nation on Earth. "They are sending a fleet," he told them. "Our intelligence suggests it will arrive in 18 months. Their mission is to destroy every human vessel beyond Mars' orbit and establish a permanent blockade around our solar system. We have 18 months to prepare for a war against an enemy whose technology is thousands of years ahead of our own." The room was silent. The leaders of nations that had spent decades threatening each other with nuclear weapons now sat side by side, facing a threat that made their old conflicts seem like children fighting over toys. Dr. Samantha Blake stood up from her seat near the back. She was the director of the Global Research Initiative, a brilliant physicist who had spent her career studying theoretical concepts that most people considered impossible. She was small and quiet, with gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that burned with fierce intelligence. "Admiral Palmer is correct that we cannot match their technology through normal development," she said. "They have had thousands of years to build what they have. We have months. But humans have never advanced through gradual steps. We advance through desperate leaps. We do our best work when we have no other choice." Walked to the front of the room and activated a display showing complex equations and diagrams that most people in the room could not understand. "I am proposing something that has never been done in galactic history," she continued. "Complete technological transformation in less than 2 years. We will take everything we learned from our brief contact with alien technology. We will combine it with every secret project and classified research program on Earth, and we will build something new." The Assembly voted unanimously to approve her proposal. For the first time in human history, every nation on Earth agreed on something. They would work together, or they would die alone. Factories that had produced cars and electronics were converted to military production within weeks. Universities became research centers working around the clock. Scientists who had spent their careers competing for grants and glory now shared every discovery openly. The entire global economy was restructured around a single goal: survival. Commander Nathan Cole was a test pilot stationed at the Nevada Proving Grounds. He was 34 years old, with quick reflexes and a reputation for staying calm in situations that would make other pilots panic. When Dr. Blake asked for volunteers to fly experimental vessels using untested alien technology, he was the first to raise his hand. "You understand that this could kill you?" she told him during their first meeting. "We are combining systems that have never been designed to work together. The physics involved are barely understood. Every flight is a gamble." Nathan smiled at her with the easy confidence of a man who had faced death many times before. "Doctor, I was going to die anyway when that alien fleet arrives. At least this way I get to fly something interesting." The first 6 prototypes failed in various spectacular ways. One exploded on the launch pad. Another achieved such speed that it tore itself apart from the inside. A third simply vanished, leaving behind only a brief burst of radiation that scientists could not explain. Nathan survived each test through a combination of skill, luck, and ejection systems that worked faster than human thought. Prototype 7 was different. It combined human engineering with technology reverse-engineered from the alien communications they had intercepted. Its hull was made of materials that had not existed 6 months earlier. Its engines bent the fabric of space in ways that the Galactic Concorde had taken 400 years to develop. Nathan took it up on a cold morning in November. He pushed the throttle forward and felt the universe shift around him. Stars that had been points of light became streaks of color. He crossed the distance to the moon in seconds. He reached the orbit of Mars in under an hour. When he finally brought the ship to a stop at the edge of the solar system, he was laughing with pure joy. "Control, this is Prototype 7, he reported. His voice crackled across the void to the listening stations on Earth. They built their technology over thousands of years. They made it efficient and stable and safe. We built ours in months out of desperation and spite. We made it to win." Back on Earth, Admiral Palmer watched the test results with growing hope. Around him, thousands of workers labored day and night to build more ships like Prototype 7. Millions of people around. The world had volunteered for military service. Billions more worked in factories and farms and laboratories, all focused on the same goal. Dr. Blake came to stand beside him at the observation window. Outside, the skeleton of a massive space station was taking shape, assembled by robots that worked without rest. "Will it be enough?" Palmer asked her quietly. She watched the construction for a long moment before answering. "I have studied the Concorde's technology extensively. They are powerful, yes, but they are also old and comfortable. They have not faced a real challenge in thousands of years. They have forgotten what it means to fight for survival." She turned to look at him with those fierce, burning eyes. "We have never forgotten. It is written into our very bones. Every ancestor we have ever had survived impossible odds. That is why we are here. That is who we are." Palmer nodded slowly. He thought about his grandfather, who had stormed beaches in a war that should have been unwinnable. He thought about his great-grandmother, who had crossed an ocean with nothing but hope and determination. He thought about all the countless humans who had faced extinction and somehow found a way to keep going. 18 months, he said. "Is it enough time?" Dr. Blake smiled, and there was something almost frightening in that smile. "It will have to be." The months passed in a blur of activity. Human ships multiplied like stars being born. Defense platforms spread across the solar system in a web of firepower and sensors. Soldiers trained in tactics that had never been used before, learning to fight in 3 dimensions against enemies they had never seen. When the Concorde suppression fleet finally appeared at the edge of the solar system, they expected to find a primitive world cowering in fear. They expected easy victory and quick submission. They expected the same result they had achieved against 11 other young species. They found something else entirely. They found a species that had turned desperation into determination. They found a world united in purpose for the first time in its history. They found weapons and ships and soldiers ready to fight. For their right to exist, they found humanity waiting for them with fire in their eyes and fury in their hearts. Fleet Commander Voreth of the Zalori Dominion had led suppression missions against 11 species in his long career. Each mission had followed the same pattern. The young species would see his fleet and feel terror. They would attempt some form of resistance, usually pathetic and disorganized. Then they would negotiate. Then they would surrender. The quarantine would be established, the primitives would be contained, and galactic order would be maintained. It was simple and efficient and had worked perfectly for thousands of years. He expected the humans to follow the same pattern. He was wrong. The Concorde fleet emerged from hyperspace near the orbit of Neptune. 300 warships of various sizes spread out in perfect formation. Their shields glowed with power that could withstand asteroid impacts. Their weapons could crack moons in half. Voreth stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the distant blue dot that was Earth with something close to boredom. "Launch the first wave of suppression drones," he ordered. "Standard approach pattern. Let us remind these creatures of their place in the universe." 2,000 drones shot forward toward the inner solar system. They were small and fast, designed to disable primitive technology with targeted electromagnetic pulses. They had never failed before. They crossed the orbit of Uranus, then Saturn, then Jupiter, and then they simply ceased to exist. Vorith stared at his tactical display in confusion. One moment the drones were there, moving in perfect formation. The next moment there was nothing but expanding clouds of debris. What happened? He demanded. His tactical officer was already working frantically at his console. Unknown weapons, fire commander. Source appears to be a network of automated defense platforms positioned throughout the system. Sensors are detecting thousands of them. That is impossible, Vorith said. His voice was calm, but his silver skin had paled slightly. 18 months ago, these creatures had barely developed fusion power. They could not have built such a network. And yet they have, Commander. Vorith considered his options. The defense network was unexpected, but surely it could not withstand the full force of a Concord battle fleet. These were humans, after all. Primitive apes who had barely learned to walk upright. All ships forward, he commanded. Full combat formation. We will sweep aside their toys and complete our mission. The fleet moved inward. As they passed Jupiter, they encountered the first human warships. Admiral Palmer watched the enemy fleet on the display screens of Sentinel Prime, the command station that now orbited Mars. His face showed no fear, only cold calculation. Beside him, Commander Nathan Cole waited with barely contained energy, eager to get into a cockpit. They outnumber us 3-1, Palmer observed. Their ships are larger and more heavily armed. Their shields are superior. Their weapons have greater range, so we have them right where we want them, Nathan replied with a grin. Palmer allowed himself a small smile. Yes, we do. He opened a communication channel to the approaching fleet. His words reached Commander Vorath across the void of space. This is Admiral Gregory Palmer of the Earth Defense Coalition. You are entering sovereign human territory. You have one chance to turn around and leave peacefully. If you continue your approach, you will face the consequences of your actions. Vorath's response came quickly. This is Commander Vorith of the Galactic Concord. You have no sovereign territory. You have no rights. You have only the fate that we have decided for you. Surrender now, and the suppression will be merciful. Palmer cut the channel without responding. He looked at the officers around him. Men and women from every nation on Earth who had trained for this moment. Units engage, he said simply. The battle that followed would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries to come. It lasted 6 hours and changed everything the Concord believed about warfare. Lieutenant Commander Michelle Torres led a squadron of 12 fighters against a Zellery carrier that was 500 times their size. Standard doctrine said fighters should harass larger vessels while capital ships delivered killing blows. Michelle had read the standard doctrine. She had also decided to ignore it completely. All wings form up on me, she ordered through her helmet communicator. We are going straight for their reactor core. That is insane, one of her pilots responded. Their shields will vaporize us. Not if we hit the right frequency. Dr. Blake found a gap in their shield harmonics that the Zellery do not even know exists. We have exactly one chance to exploit it. Follow my lead, and do not hesitate. 12 human fighters dove toward the massive carrier. Zellery weapons fire filled the space around them with deadly light. 2 fighters were destroyed in the first seconds. 3 more took heavy damage and fell back. But the remaining 7 kept coming. Michelle pushed her ship harder than it was designed to go. Alarms screamed in her cockpit. Her vision blurred from the acceleration, but she found the gap in the carrier's shields and punched through it like a needle through cloth, inside the shield envelope. She released her payload. 7 antimatter warheads, each one small enough to hold in 2 hands, detonated against the carrier's reactor housing. The explosion was visible from Mars. Across the battle, human forces employed tactics that the Concord had never seen before. They used asteroids as cover. They played dead and then attacked from behind. They rammed enemy vessels with ships whose crews had already evacuated. They fought with a creativity and ferocity that the comfortable Concord officers simply could not understand. Commander Nathan Cole led his squadron through the heart of the enemy formation. Destroying 3 cruisers and damaging a dozen more, He flew maneuvers that Concord tactical computers classified as physically impossible. When his weapons ran dry, he used his engines to destabilize enemy shields so other ships could finish them off. Commander Voroth watched his fleet dying around him and felt something he had not experienced in centuries. He felt fear. "All ships fall back," he ordered finally. His voice was no longer calm. "Retreat to the outer system. We will await reinforcements." The Concord fleet withdrew, leaving behind the wreckage of 4 out of every 10 ships they had brought. Behind them, the humans collected their own dead and began repairs. They had lost ships and pilots too. The victory had come at a terrible cost, but they had won. Admiral Palmer addressed the people of Earth that night. His face was tired and his uniform was stained with smoke, but his voice was strong. "Today, we proved that we will not go quietly into extinction. Today, we showed the galaxy that humanity will fight for its right to exist. We have won a battle. The war is far from over. They will return with more ships and more weapons. But now they know what we are capable of. Now they understand that the species they dismissed as primitive has teeth." On the bridge of his damaged flagship, Commander Voroth composed a message to the Galactic Concord. His words would send shockwaves through a civilization that had known only peace and dominance for thousands of years. "The humans are not what we expected. They do not fight like any species we have encountered before. They fight like creatures who have already lost everything. They fight like they have nothing left to fear. Send reinforcements. Send everything we have. And pray to whatever gods you worship that it will be enough." The galaxy had made its decision about humanity. Now humanity was making a decision about the galaxy. And it was becoming clear that one of those decisions had been a very serious mistake. The Galactic Concord's response to their first defeat was predictable. They assembled a second fleet 3 times larger than the first. Admiral Kithrin himself took command, the same ambassador who had led the vote against humanity 18 months earlier. He was determined to personally oversee the extinction of the species that had humiliated his people. What the Concord did not know was that humanity had no intention of waiting for their arrival. The time for defense was over. The time for attack had begun. Captain Lauren Webb was 38 years old and had spent most of her adult life as a submarine commander in the deep oceans of Earth. She understood silence and patience. And striking from unexpected directions, when Admiral Palmer offered her command of the first true interstellar mission since Daniel Harris had met the Council, she accepted without hesitation. "The enemy is assembling at the edge of our solar system," Palmer told her during their final briefing. "They expect us to fortify and wait for them. They expect us to be afraid. Instead, you will take 6 ships beyond our borders and hit them where they least expect it." Lauren studied the tactical maps with careful eyes. The Morvathi communication hub. Without it, their fleet coordination falls apart. Exactly. And while you strike there, Commander Patterson will lead a ground team to the Varaxi industrial complex. They produce most of the Concord's military hardware. If we can compromise their production, the enemy's strength becomes a wasting resource. It was a dangerous plan. No human vessel had traveled beyond the solar system since Daniel Harris had returned with the Council's sentence. The 6 ships under Lauren's command would be completely alone, surrounded by hostile territory with no hope of rescue if things went wrong. She accepted the mission anyway. Fear was a luxury humans could no longer afford. The journey took 3 weeks. Lauren's task force used hyperspace lanes that the Concorde did not know humans had mapped. They traveled in complete silence, their ships running cold to avoid detection. Her crew of 300 became ghosts, moving through enemy space. The Morvathi homeworld was beautiful in a strange and alien way. Great cities of living crystal rose from the surface, catching the light of their blue sun and scattering it in rainbows across the clouds. The Morvathi themselves were creatures of silicon and light, ancient beyond human comprehension, confident in their absolute safety. No enemy had attacked their world in 8,000 years. Their defensive systems were considered the finest in the galaxy. They had never been tested against an opponent who had nothing to lose. Lauren positioned her ships behind a small moon that orbited the Morvathi colony where their primary communication array was located. The array itself was massive, a structure of crystal and metal that stretched kilometers into the sky. Through it flowed every command signal that coordinated the Concorde's military forces. "All ships report ready," her tactical officer announced. Lieutenant Daniel Price was young and eager, his hands steady on his console despite the fear that must have been churning in his stomach. "My mark," Lauren said calmly. "We get one chance at this. Make it count." 6 human ships surged forward from behind the moon. The Morvathi defenders were caught completely off guard. They had been watching the wrong direction, expecting threats from outside their space rather than from within it. By the time their weapons powered up, the human ships were already inside their defensive perimeter. The attack lasted exactly 12 minutes. Lauren's ships struck the communication array with precision, weapons designed specifically to disrupt crystalline structures. The massive tower cracked and shattered, its fragments falling like deadly rain across the landscape below. Secondary explosions rippled through the surrounding facilities as stored energy found new and destructive outlets. When it was over, the Morvathi communication network was fractured beyond quick repair. Every Concorde fleet in 3 sectors suddenly found themselves deaf and blind, unable to coordinate with each other or with Central Command far across the galaxy. Commander Eric Patterson was completing his own mission. He was a quiet man with scars on his hands from decades of covert operations on Earth. His team of 40 specialists had infiltrated the Vrexy industrial complex using stolen credentials and forged identities. They had spent 2 weeks working as maintenance technicians, mapping the facility and preparing their strike. The Varaxi factories produced 70% of the Concorde's military hardware. Weapons and shields and ship components flowed from their assembly lines in endless streams. The insects who ran the facilities were efficient and methodical, but they had grown complacent after centuries of unchallenged dominance. Patterson's team did not destroy the factories. Destruction would have been too obvious, too easy to repair. Instead, they infected the production systems with a virus that introduced microscopic flaws into every weapon system produced. Shield generators that looked perfect would fail under combat stress. Weapons that passed every test would misfire at critical moments. The corruption was subtle enough to pass inspection, but devastating enough to cripple any force that relied on the compromised equipment. By the time the Vroxy discovered the sabotage, millions of flawed components had already been distributed throughout the Concorde's military. Every ship, every weapon, every defensive system became a potential point of failure. Back in the solar system, Admiral Palmer received word that both missions had succeeded. He allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction before turning to the battle that lay ahead. The Concorde fleet was still 3 times larger than anything humanity could field, but now that fleet was fighting blind, unable to coordinate effectively. Unsure whether their own weapons would function when needed, he gave the order to attack. The second great battle of the war was not a desperate defense like the first. It was a calculated offensive that exploited every advantage the covert operations had created. Human vessels struck at predetermined weak points, targeting the ships most likely to be carrying compromised equipment. The Concorde fleet, designed to fight as a unified force, crumbled when that unity was stripped away. Admiral Kithrin watched from his flagship as his carefully assembled armada fell into chaos. Ships that should have been coordinating their fire instead shot at empty space. Shields that should have held failed without warning. Vessels that should have covered each other's flanks drifted out of position, their navigation systems feeding them incorrect data. What is happening? He demanded of his officers. Why is nothing working as it should? No one could give him an answer. The Zelori had not faced a true enemy in so long that they had forgotten what it meant to be outmaneuvered. They had grown soft in their dominance, certain that superior numbers and technology would always carry the day. The battle lasted for hours. When it ended, Admiral Kithrin fled with less than a quarter of his ships. The rest were destroyed or captured or drifting dead in the void between worlds. His final transmission before retreating to Zelori space was intercepted by human intelligence. The words would be remembered for generations. They do not fight like any species we have encountered before. They fight like creatures who have already lost everything. They fight like they have nothing left to fear. We made them this way. We voted to take their future, and in doing so, we created the most dangerous enemy the galaxy has ever known. On Earth, the people celebrated their second great victory. But Admiral Palmer knew the war was not over. The Concorde still held 1,000 worlds. They still had resources that dwarfed anything humanity could muster. The battles won so far were just the beginning. But the tide had turned. The species that had been condemned to imprisonment was now taking the fight to its accusers. The quarantine that was meant to contain humanity forever had instead forged them into something the galaxy had never seen before. The hunters had become the hunted, and they were only beginning to understand how badly they had miscalculated. The war lasted 3 more years. It was not a conflict fought for territory or resources or any of the usual reasons civilizations went to war. It was a fundamental reshaping of power in the galaxy. A transformation that would echo through the centuries that followed, one by one. The species that had voted against Earth found themselves facing an impossible choice: continue fighting and risk total destruction, or seek peace with the very species they had tried to imprison. The Viraxi, their industrial capacity crippled by Patterson's sabotage, were the first to send envoys to negotiate. Their clicking voices carried messages of surrender that would have been unthinkable. Just years earlier, the Morvathi followed soon after. Their communication networks remained unreliable despite months of repair work. The crystalline beings who had once looked down on humanity with contempt now looked at them with something close to respect. They had underestimated the young species badly. They were wise enough to admit their mistake. Even the proud Zalori eventually bent. Admiral Kithrin himself led the delegation that traveled to the edge of human space under a flag of truce. The silver-skinned beings who had dismissed humanity as primitive, apes now treated them as equals, deserving of careful diplomacy. The final session of the Galactic Concorde was held on neutral ground. A space station had been constructed for this purpose. Built jointly by human engineers and the ancient Sitharani who had abstained from the original vote, it floated in the void between stars, belonging to no one and everyone at once. Ambassador Christopher Hayes represented Earth at this historic gathering. He was a career diplomat who had spent decades negotiating trade deals and border disputes between human nations. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment, but he carried himself with quiet dignity as he faced the same council. That had condemned his species to extinction. The chamber was smaller than the Great Hall, where Daniel Harris had received humanity's sentence. It was designed for conversation rather than proclamation, with the representatives of all species seated at the same level. No one looked down on anyone else. "We are here to end a war and build something new," Hayes began. His voice was calm and measured, the voice of a man who understood that peace required as much strength as conflict. The Galactic Concorde that once ruled these stars no longer exists. Its authority collapsed when it tried to suppress a species that refused to be suppressed. We cannot simply put the old system back together and pretend nothing has changed. Ambassador Kithrin shifted in his seat. The arrogance that had once defined his every word and gesture was gone, replaced by weary acceptance. "What do you propose? A new organization? One based on mutual respect and equal partnership? One where no species can vote to imprison another without consequences? One where the strong protects the weak instead of exploiting them?" The negotiations lasted 7 days. Old grievances were aired and addressed. New agreements were drafted and revised. The Viraxi demanded guarantees for their industrial autonomy. The Morvathi wanted assurances about communication network security. A dozen other species raised concerns that had to be carefully balanced. Through it all, the Sitharani watched in silence. The ancient beings of light and energy had seen civilizations rise and fall for longer than most stars had burned. They observed the proceedings with eyes that held the wisdom of ages, speaking only when their words could help bridge divides that seemed impossible to cross. On the 7th day, the treaty was signed. The Galactic Concorde was formally dissolved. In its place, the Interstellar Coalition was born, with Earth as a founding member, holding equal status with species that had ruled the stars while humanity was still learning to make fire. Admiral Gregory Palmer attended the signing ceremony. He was old now, his hair completely white, his body worn by years of constant war. But his eyes still held the same determination that had carried humanity through its darkest hours. After the ceremony, the Scythran ambassador approached him. The being's form shimmered with colors that had no names in human language. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You knew," Palmer said. It was not a question. When you abstained from the original vote, you knew what would happen. The Scythrane's response was slow and deliberate. "We have watched young species rise for longer than your world has existed. Some surrender when they face adversity. They accept their fate and fade into obscurity. Some are destroyed by the challenges they encounter. They burn bright for a moment and then vanish forever." As the ancient being paused, its form pulsing with gentle light. "But some, the rarest, are forged by their trials into something greater than they were before. We recognized in your eyes what we once saw in our own, long ago, when we were young and struggling to survive in a hostile universe. We knew that the vote against Earth would either end your species or create something magnificent." Palmer considered this for a long moment. Around them, delegates from 20 different species mingled and talked. Former enemies finding common ground for the first time. Human officers stood beside Vroxy commanders. Morvathi scientists discussed research with their human counterparts. The impossible had become ordinary. "And which did it create?" he asked finally. The Scythrane looked out at the gathered delegates, at the ships of 100 worlds holding formation in peaceful array, at the representatives of species who had learned through bitter experience that humanity was not to be underestimated. "The galaxy will spend the next 10,000 years answering that question. We look forward to witnessing how your species will shape the future. You have earned your place among the stars. What you do with that place remains to be seen." Daniel Harris was there too, older now, his hair completely gray. The captain, who had first faced the council's judgment, had become a symbol of humanity's determination. People from every species recognized him as they passed, some with respect, some with lingering resentment. All with acknowledgement that his words of warning had proven prophetic. Katie Morrison stood beside him, promoted to admiral after her service in the war. She watched the delegates mingle and allowed herself a small smile. "We did it," she said quietly. "We actually did it." Daniel nodded slowly. "We did. But this is not the end. It is barely the beginning." On Earth, the quarantine monuments remained standing. They had been preserved not as symbols of oppression, but as reminders of how close humanity had come to eternal imprisonment. Schools brought children to see them, teaching them the history of how their species had faced extinction and emerged stronger. The stars that had once been forbidden now welcomed humanity as partners and equals. Trade routes opened between Earth and 100 worlds. Human ships traveled freely through the galaxy, exploring places that their ancestors had only dreamed about. The species that had balloted against Earth learned a lesson that would echo through galactic history. Humanity was not a threat to be contained. They were not primitive creatures to be dismissed. They were a force that had been forged in the fire of adversity, shaped by the very attempt to destroy them into something the galaxy had never seen before, and underestimating them. The Council learned was always their last mistake: the end.